Hello, and welcome to another edition of the GNAT TV News Project In Depth. My name is Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT TV. It's my pleasure to be with you. Glad to have you with us today. It's December 28th, 2016. This is our last in-depth show of the year. So we're happy to have you with us, and also wanted to wish you a happy new year, and we're all looking forward, I'm sure, to a happy and prosperous 2017. Also, the first week of January, about a week from today, we'll see the start of the state legislature reconvening, starting a new biennium, a fancy way of saying a new two-year term. And so we're all going to be interested to see what our state representatives and state senators come up with, and what happens up north in Montpelier. And with us today to help make some sense of that and give us a little clue as to what might be going on are two state representatives from the Bennington County 4 district, which includes Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and most of Sunderland. Here today are Cynthia Browning, a Democrat from Arlington, who's been in the state legislature since 2006, so this will be her sixth term. Along with her is Brian Keefe, a Republican from Manchester, who will be starting his first term, having won election back in November. Folks, great to have you with us today. And just to get us started, I mean, one thing that kind of jumps out of the box right away as we look at the legislature and how things are shaping up for this coming year is that we have a whole slate of new leaders at the top of things there in Montpelier. We have a new governor in Phil Scott replacing Peter Shumlin, a new lieutenant governor, David Zuckerman, a former state senator from Chittenden County, who is replacing Phil Scott, who moved up to the governorship. Over in the legislature, we have a new Speaker of the House, Mitzi Johnson, a representative from South Hero and a former chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee, now taking over as Speaker of the House, replacing Shap Smith, who had served in that post since, I think, 2009. And then over in the state Senate, we have a new president pro tem, or leader of the Senate, Tim Ash, a progressive Democrat from Chittenden County, will be taking over from John Campbell. So, Cynthia, let me turn to you first, since you've been around the legislature for a few years now. What do you make of that? Does that portend anything is going to be different in the way business gets done, or how the legislation moves through the state house, or will it just be really not that big of a deal?
Well, I think it's going to be different because it's different people and it's a different arrangement of party powers because, of course, recently we've had the Democrats in control of both the House and the Senate and the governorship, and now the governorship will be Republican and the Democrats still have the legislature. And I think it might be a little bit more like when Governor Douglas was in office, and that was my first two terms, I think, because you have you tend to have to go to the center more, which in general I think is a good thing. But you don't know how it's going to work out. All of these people have been in the legislature or in the building for quite a while, so they're not unknown. But they are different. I mean, when you think about it, Mitzi Johnson has been running the Appropriations Committee. She has she has a lot of different experience in terms of her personal work life. And Shap Smith was a corporate lawyer, and he liked to make deals. And I'm quoting him exactly. He loved the end of the session because he loved to make deals. Now, certainly Mitzi knows how to make a deal, but she is really, really involved in the nuts and bolts and how the budget is structured, and I think that's very significant. Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of opportunities here. I personally am happy because I was at odds with the Speaker Smith and Governor Shumlin over quite a number of issues, and so I'm hoping that I can start out on a what is it, fresh foot, first new foot, or whatever,
whatever. Right.
Yeah. So I'm hoping to be able to work productively with people because I don't have that same history.
Okay, Brian, what's your takeaway on that? Is this going to be an opportunity for someone like yourself who was familiar with the building? You served there as a lobbyist for CVPS, and also you worked with Senator Jim Jeffers as a legislative aide, so you know your way around the State House. But do you think this creates more opportunities for someone like yourself coming in?
I think it's hard to tell where the session's going to go because there's a lot of ideas on the table and there's a lot of budget challenges. But I agree with Cynthia that even though there is new leadership, it's experienced leadership. Representative Mitzi Johnson, as you pointed out, was chair of the Appropriations Committee for 6 years, I think, so she knows the budget as well as anyone. And then in the Senate, you have progressives have a lot more power than they did before, so who knows exactly how that will affect that chamber. I think I expect to be busy enough in the House to not worry too much about the Senate. But I think the most refreshing thing is a new governor, and I feel that some level of excitement there, because the new governor, Phil Scott, he's different in substance and in style than Peter Shumlin, and Peter Shumlin had some successes and he had some drawbacks, and I'm sure Phil will have his challenges as well, but he is focused on the budget, he's focused on affordability, he's not a flashy guy, he wants to get things done, he wants to solve solutions and keep Vermont as a great place to live and raise a family.
Well, let's start with that because, as always, taxing and spending questions will probably dominate the agenda, and as you point out, Phil Scott ran on a theme of making Vermont affordable, which I assume means somewhere or another cutting the cost of living or cutting taxes or something, leaving more money in folks' pocketbooks. So what programs or taxes or areas do you think might be, is the right word, vulnerable to a budget axe or tinkering with? Is there anything that stands out as we're about to start here that says, hey, we could probably do something over here and kind of move that affordability agenda along?
Well, I've been calling for fundamental budget and tax reform for quite some time. I feel as if the state is trying to do too much in too many different ways, and we don't always keep good track of whether we're getting our money's worth. So it isn't a question necessarily of corruption or waste or anything like that. It just can be program duplication, or it can be failing to have objective measures of what you've accomplished for the money spent or the tax credit given. And I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. I think that everything the state does should be formally auditable. The state auditor, Doug Hoffer, has tried to audit certain programs in the Agency of Services and certain programs in the Vermont Economic Development policy area. He can't audit them because there's not sufficient objective information and clear policy goals. So everything should be auditable so that we know that we're getting our money's worth. And I think that if we did fundamental tax reform, we could end up lowering tax rates, broadening the tax base, and achieving our policy goals in a more transparent and accountable way. Now, some of that is, I know, a lot of sort of economic speak, and I apologize for that, but that's where you have to go if you want to understand this. You can't just keep layering new tax credits or new programs on top of what you already have. Another thing that I think that Governor-elect Scott has made is that you aren't always necessarily cutting anything so much as slowing the rate of growth. Because if you can halt the rate of growth, so you're still doing something, it's just not growing by 3% every year, you can kind of let the capacity of the state to support the programs catch up with what you're doing. And I know I've heard him talk about that kind of issue. So I don't think we're necessarily looking at massive cuts of key support programs, but we may be looking at slowing rates of growth or saying we've been doing this every year, we're going to take a break for a year. And that might be enough. Mm-hmm. But to me, it can't just be on the budget side. It has to be on the tax side, because we have 1.3 billion, there I go with a number, of tax credits and expenditures that we're not really auditing or tracking.
Okay. Brian, what's your take on it? Do you think there are some areas where taxes could be cut or the growth rate of spending modified in some way that would kind of help get us towards that better, more affordable kind of state to live in?
Well, I agree with what Cynthia said at the end, or most of what she said, but at the end where she pointed out that we have a revenue growth every year. And so, as Phil Scott said many times in his campaign, let's stay below that rate of growth. So that allows some capacity for spending increases here. But of course, there's a lot of spending pressures. There's inflation expenses, there's state employees, contracts that have cost of living, there's a lot of medical healthcare costs keep going up. So there's a lot of cost pressures, but we do have a growing revenue number. And part of the trick is I think going forward in Vermont is to have a robust economy so that growth, that annual natural growth is even higher. So there's things that we can do like straighten out the worker classification program. I think school choice is something we should encourage rather than discourage as a way to encourage young people to come to Vermont. There's a lot of ideas out there on the economic growth agenda. And meanwhile, we have some big spending issues. Pensions are underfunded. I heard on the campaign a lot about human service spending, that maybe we need a better accounting on how it's all done, because we all want to take care of people who are vulnerable and in need a hand up. But I got a lot of sense from people in this district that they wanted the state to be a little bit more responsible in how they spend our taxpayer money in supporting worthy social service programs. And I think there's room, and this is nothing new. None of these things are new. These things get talked about. And then just real quickly, there's some big ideas up in Montpelier to spend more money or to levy more taxes. I think the carbon tax is still alive and well the closer you get to Chittenden County, and that to me is a big, dangerous place to go. And then I frankly wasn't quite aware of the extent of the Lake Champlain spending challenge, but there's a lot of people up there that think that we're ready to find $60 million a year in new taxes for Lake Champlain cleanup. $60 million a year for 20 years. That's a lot of money and new money. So that's something I have a little growth curve to get to on that one. Right. But there's big ideas up there for big taxes and big spending that go beyond the incremental thing in minding our business. And I'm of the like to let's stick to our knitting and let's get through the next couple of years within the natural growth of the budget.
And there's picking up on what Brian said, because I think it's really, really important, is we've made this commitment to clean up Lake Champlain. Actually, it's supposed to be the whole state, but we know it's really Lake Champlain. And also this commitment to these comprehensive energy goals, like 90% renewable by 2050. When those commitments were made, we didn't really know how much either of them were going to cost, and we didn't have a way of financing either of them. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Does that sound like the commitment to single payer? Bingo, okay? So really big, ambitious plans, make a commitment without really knowing how you're going to do it. Now, I actually share all of those goals, get everybody covered by health insurance, clean up our waterways, and control our fossil fuel use. But to ask people to make commitments without understanding what they're committing to is a recipe for backlash and disaster. And I think that what we're seeing is now people are saying, oh, well, we have to pass such and such because we already made this commitment. And I think that's wrong. And for people to be talking about layering the carbon tax on top of this complicated, contradictory tax system that we have is just absurd. There are places in the tax code where we already actually favor fossil fuels. Why don't we go in and fix those and do total tax reform before we start about layering new things on? But they don't want to do it. It's too hard.
Let me just stop you there and just clarify what exactly a carbon tax involves, because that term has got batted around a lot in the campaign trail. I think it's been very confusing to a lot of people as to exactly what that involves. It kind of came out of the box initially as almost like a gas tax. I mean, I remember the whole thing about it was going to raise the price of gasoline by 88 cents a gallon or something like that, and everyone went in a circle over that, quite understandably. But it doesn't. It's more than a gasoline tax, is it not?
Yes, but first of all, the concept of a carbon tax can be done a whole lot of different ways. It basically just means that you put a tax on when you use something, particularly fossil fuels, that emits carbon. So that would be heating oil or coal or gasoline. So you put some kind of, or propane, it would be some kind of tax. Now, where those actual figures came from is because there was a bill introduced that would have put a tax on that was small at first, and then gradually over time it would have grown to, whatever it was, 88 cents. And then the revenue would have been rebated to Vermonters theoretically and used on efficiency and conservation.
And I think also used to cut part of the state sales tax, if I recall.
Yes,
correctly.
and they were going to do that. So that is a kind of a part, sort of a nod towards tax reform. And the idea is that why are you taxing it when people are doing or buying something good? Tax them when they're buying something that's destructive to the environment. And again, conceptually, you can understand the justification. But what they proposed was too extreme, and they didn't do enough tax reform to make room for it. So I think Brian's right. I think that they will, that some people in Montpelier will reintroduce the carbon tax bill. But until we do the fundamental work of tax reform and rationalizing and clarifying, resolving the contradictions, I'm not in support.
So Brian, since you raised the question or brought it into the discussion, I just want to give you the last word on this. So what's wrong? What's so horribly wrong about a carbon tax, particularly if there's a rebate involved where it would be offset to some degree by a reduction in the state sales tax, which is, I'm sure we all can agree, is a regressive kind of tax. It's higher than, it would be nice to see it go down. I mean, you would think that, trying to do something to reduce fossil fuel use, particularly with the state trying to get to 90% of renewable use of renewable energy by 2050. I realize that's more than 30 years off, but it's going to get here pretty quickly. What would be the harm in starting off with some kind of a carbon tax?
Well, we have several taxes you could call carbon taxes already. There's an efficiency charge on your electric bill. You look at your bill, you see it there. You could call that a carbon tax. There's preferential buying at the utility level. You could call that a carbon tax. There's a gross receipts tax on gasoline and fuel oil and propane now. You could call that a
And there's a gas tax.
And there's a gas,
Right.
which mainly goes for infrastructure,
Yeah.
but you're right. So we have a lot of
Carbon
things
taxes already.
that add up to probably over $100 million, I would guess easily, but I'm not sure. But and it is, as Cynthia pointed out, the carbon tax would, as it was proposed, would be gradual, be phased in. I would be against it if it was a milk tax or a potato chip tax or a pen tax. I'm just fundamentally against raising taxes for the sake of raising taxes. Now, so that's where I would start. But it puts us at a competitive disadvantage with our neighbors, for one thing. We're in Bennington County. If gas costs 88 cents more in Arlington than it did over in Hoosick, who's going to? And we have a lot of people that travel from New York back and forth to Vermont every day. Mm-hmm. So if all of a sudden our gas is a quarter or 50 cents or 75 or $1 more expensive, we're going to lose those sales revenues, so we don't actually gain the revenues as projected, and it hurts the people that are forced to buy the gasoline at that higher taxes. The people that work, the plumbers and electricians, they're not going to go over to New York, but meanwhile they'll be bidding against contractors from New York that are filling their vehicles up over there. So it's non-competitive. And if the goal is to thwart global warming, I'm sorry, little Vermont is not going to end or have an impact on climate change by raising the price of our fuel. Right. And then just finally, in general speaking, it's a regressive tax. And I think when you do taxation, you should avoid regressive taxes, go for progressive taxes, because the people who earn more should pay more in proportion to their earnings. So when you start at a gas tax or a fuel oil tax or a propane tax, it hits the poorest among us a lot harder than it hits the people that are more well off. And that's the wrong way to do taxation.
All right. Well, let's move along to another spending issue here, which is another hardy perennial of political discussion in Vermont, and that's, of course, education spending. 2 years ago, I guess it would be, in 2014, the legislature passed Act 46, a landmark bill, 2015. That was tweaked slightly towards the start of the session last year. I guess question number one on this subject would be, do you think we're done tweaking Act 46? I mean, I've heard people say, well, there might be change, legislature might come along and do this or that. Do we think that basically the act as it is now is basically what we're going to have for the next 4 or so years as various school districts work through trying to consolidate or overhaul their governance structures and comply with the legislation? Or is this an ongoing subject for more discussion? And Brian, I'll let you go first this time.
I mean, education reform happens every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. It has for the last 20, 30, 40, 80 years. So, but as to the immediate question, I would like to see towns be given more time without being penalized if they're not able to comply with the governance consolidation of Act 46. The larger Manchester, Sunderland area, Dorset, Danby, the mountain towns seem to be on their path. But Sandgate is still, it's unknown to me where that's going to, Arlington. I just think that towns that have a harder time to meet the mandates shouldn't face the financial penalties that are in the law. The mountain towns, these are not our district, but up in Reedsboro, Wilmington, up in the Deerfield Valley, they went through all the study. They came up with a plan. It was rejected by the state, and now they have to kind of go back to the drawing board. It's just, I would like to see the penalties relaxed for towns that need more time to comply.
I mean, I guess to me, one of the basic tests of whether or not Act 46 is going to work is whether or not it's going to save money in the long run. I mean, education taxes and spending in Vermont have been high for a long time. I think right now, roughly 1/3 of the state budget goes for education spending, which is kind of a shocking number when you stop and think about it. But I mean, Cynthia, do you anticipate anything new happening on the education spending front coming up this year?
I think there might be some changes to Act 46 because I pushed for revisions to Act 46 last session. I pushed for more time. I pushed for more flexibility in the merger structures, particularly something called side-by-sides. Don't worry about it. And also, I actually had an amendment that would have made merging voluntary. So people it makes sense for absolutely should do it, should get rewarded for it, but if it doesn't make sense for you, you shouldn't have to do it. I feel like too much power was given to this unelected State Board of Education. So I already tried to do that, and when I was pushing for that last year, and there were other legislators who supported my provisions, but the message I got from leadership was it's too soon. Next year we'll tweak it. It's too soon. We don't want to discourage the people who are engaged in these conversations. And so that was the message I got then. So in other words, I'm going back and I'm saying, okay, now, right? And I don't know what kind of message I'm going to get. But I know that it's going to be really hard to get everybody accommodated under the existing rigidity because it never made sense for everybody. Everybody knew that. So we need to have more time and more flexibility. I'd also like to point out that the rewards to the district that merge are actually coming from the education fund. So if you happen to already be in a union school district or for some reason you can't merge, your property taxes are being used to reward the districts that merge. The state is not paying for it. The property taxes are.
There's one fixed pool of money, and folks who are able to fashion an agreement now
are going to get a reduction
taxes,
and other people,
comes out
which I think is really illegitimate. But this question of is it going to work? Remember, there were a number of goals. There was quality, equity, and also affordability or some kind of cost control thing. And I've heard things recently where people are saying, "Oh yeah, well, it probably isn't going to save any money," and you're sort of like, then you're admitting that you kind of misled us. It's like because they want because the superintendents want to have fewer meetings every month, as far as I can tell. And again, anybody who wants to consolidate should. It's a useful thing to do if it makes sense for your district. So I think that it's not going to save money because when you have the one big district, you'll have an expansion of administrators anyway. I just don't think it's going to save a lot of money. I think the problem in our education finance system needs fundamental reform in terms of how the state organizes it. When Act 60 went into effect and the education fund was created, the state took a number of things that were spending items in the state budget and shifted their costs onto the education property tax. For instance, current use and the income sensitivity. And those costs have just ballooned. They're up to 200 million, 250 million. That's a quarter or 12% of the whole education fund. And those are not education. It's an internal transfer between some property taxpayers subsidizing other property taxpayers. There are really valid goals of both of those programs in terms of protecting forestry and agriculture, in terms of subsidizing home ownership, but they're not education, and they shouldn't be financed in the education fund. If you take them out, the property tax rate could come down by 20 cents. That would erase most of the increase over the past 10 years. Then you'd have to pay for them in the general fund, but they would cost less because you're subsidizing lower property tax rates.
So we're going to take a short break in just a second, but before we do, I just want to ask, why not have them in the general fund?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I mean-
They should go back to the general fund. But people like having them in.
So is that a political thing?
Yes,
Where,
yes,
where,
yes.
where lawmakers from certain districts don't want to have something that's going on in their district taxed, and so therefore it's easier to get it shunted over to the education fund where it's more dispersed
I
statewide?
think many people don't fully understand the way things are. And those that do may like it to have the costs not accountable. But when I gave a proposal to the Joint Fiscal Office of exactly this, and I was told, your numbers work, you're right, but your politics doesn't work.
Okay.